When kids move into the age of adolescence, we know that they begin to develop their own personalities. And they begin to pull away a little bit from mom and dad so they can begin to develop their own understandings. And usually adolescents don't like their parents' music. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. But adolescents develop their own type of music, and they listen to their own bands, and they begin to understand technology better than their parents do, and things like that. And so at each one of these stages, as we look at human beings, we understand that just by knowing how old a person is, we can begin to tell you some of the struggles and challenges that they're going to face. Now, when it comes to churches, it's the same way. Now, here is a typical life cycle of a church. And I'm going to use my little red pointer here. Right down here, we have a church that starts. Usually you have a church planter who has a vision of starting a work for God. And so they move into a community and they get a group of people together and they plant a church. They start a church. And usually the church will grow, and then eventually the church will plateau. The church will reach a point where it kind of flattens out. Its growth isn't happening anymore. And then eventually the church will decline. And then eventually the church reaches a point of stagnation, or even closes its doors. The church actually dies, goes out of business, and it doesn't meet any longer. This is a typical life cycle of a church. Now, this is just an illustration. It's not a real church. Let me show you a couple of real churches and just show you how this actually looks. I'm going to show you 3 real churches here. This is a church that was started in 1907. All of these churches, by the way, are in California, USA, because that's where I reside, and I have the opportunity to look at these churches and see their statistics. But this is happening in your churches here in Manila also. But this church was started in 1907 with about 100 people. The pastor was a very strong evangelist, and the church eventually grew, and by 1925, which is right there, the church was running about 250 people. And then around the world during that time, we had what was called the Great Depression. The financial stock markets and everything crashed and went down, and that affected the church. You can see that here. And the church lost about 300 or 400 people, and ended up, probably about 1933, 1932, had about 800 people. But then a new pastor came to the church. Pastor came from Canada. He was an evangelist, and the church started growing. And between about 1932 or so and right up here, upwards of about 1940 to 45, right in there, the church grew tremendously. And then that pastor retired, and they called a new pastor right in here around 1945, and the church continued to grow. And this pastor then was there about 20 years or so, and he retired right in here about 1970. Now you can see something was happening here. This was a big church because that's 4,000 people. This is one of the original mega churches in the United States. And you can see the last 5 years of the church's or the pastor's ministry right there. Between 1965 and about 1970, the church was plateaued. The church was not growing. Now, this is one of the dangers of larger churches. You have a lot of people, and so you come to worship and everything looks good because the auditorium's full. But what had happened was the church was already beginning to plateau and beginning to decline, but nobody knew it because the congregation was full. The auditorium was full. But this pastor was getting elderly, and he could not continue to lead the church with the same energy that he had in the early years of his ministry, and eventually he retired. Now, when he retired, they called another pastor, and as you can see here, it wasn't a good fit. They called the new pastor right in here, and the church began a rapid decline. Now, the pastor they called was a good person, and he was a good preacher. But in the United States, something happened that impacted churches in the cities. This church was in Los Angeles. This is right around 1965, 1975, right in there. After World War II, the famous American general, his name is Dwight D. Eisenhower, he had been in Germany, and he saw that Germany had built the big Autobahn for people to drive their cars. And of course, Germany needed big roads because they saw it as a way to move military equipment very quickly through the country. And so when Dwight D. Eisenhower came back to the United States, he was elected president. And one of the first things he did is he signed a bill that allowed the United States to build freeways, the big roads where people could drive their cars. And one of the reasons they did that was not just so people could have good, easy transportation, but so that if America ever got into a war, they could move military equipment across the country rapidly. Now, that had an impact upon the churches, because when they built these highways leading outside the city, people began to move out of the city and begin to purchase homes outside the city. And they would live outside the city and then drive back into the city on these roads. Those communities outside the cities began to be called suburbs. So you had the urban city core, and then you had the suburbs, which were the suburban cores of the city. Now that's what happened here. This was a downtown church in downtown Los Angeles, and people walked to church, and they rode buses to church and everything. But all of a sudden, in the late 50s and 60s, people started moving out of the big cities into these suburbs. So when this pastor retired in 1970, people took the opportunity to move and relocate. And so when the new pastor came, even though he was a good preacher and a good teacher, people were moving out of the city and moving out to new places to live. So this decline was not the pastor's fault. It was more the sociological changes that were occurring in the city and the driving patterns and the living patterns of people. But you can see how it hurt the church. So the church, over about a 10-year period, from around 1970 to about 1980, almost a 15-year period, they lost about 3,000 people, and then they ended up with about, around 800. I guess right there it's about 600. Church declined. They called another pastor. The church grew to 800. It declined. Today, this church runs about 250 people. Now, to many of you, 250 sounds like a large church. I understand. But to these people, it seems like a failure, because many of them remember the church when it had 4,000 people. And so they look back and they think, how bad this is that we're down to 240 or 250. Now, but what I want you to see is, do you see the life cycle? It's not a perfect curve, but you can see the life cycle. The church was planted, it grew, it plateaued, it declined. Now, this church is still in existence, has not closed its doors. 250 people is a pretty solid church, but you can see the impact of the life cycle. Now, how about a smaller church? Here's another church. This church was started in 1955, started with 14 people. And the first pastor stayed there, and the church grew between about 1955 and about 1965. It grew from about 14 people or so all the way up to about 100, 105 people. And then you can see the church got onto a long plateau. It went down a little, it went up a little, it went down a little, it went up a little. But it was basically between about 80 and 100 people for what? 1965, 75, 80, 20-some, 25 years. The church was plateaued, 80 to 100 people. Well, then they called a new pastor. And you can see what happened. New pastor came in right here with a new vision and was able to work with the people. And here's a turnaround. Here's a church that was stagnated at about 80 people for 20-some years, a little over 20 years. And look how it began to take off. And it grew and finally stopped at about 270, 260, something of that nature. That pastor left who was there. And they called the new pastor and the church went down. And of course, then he left because of the decline. And then they called another pastor and he stabilized the church right there around 200. And unfortunately, the Lord called him home. He had a heart attack and passed away after 10 years in the church. And then the stress level, right? He didn't take his Sabbath. I don't know. I'm just teasing you. But then they called another pastor right here, and the church declined. And today that church is running about 65 people. But again, you can see the life cycle. Here's a church that was planted, and it grew, and then it had a plateau, and then it had a new life cycle, and then it's got a decline. Again, when you look at churches, it's not a perfect curve, but you can begin to see that there's a natural up and a natural plateauing and a natural decline. As the church gets older, there's a natural decline. Now, here's a church that was started. I actually start the statistics here. This is 2004, I believe. That's right. No, that's 19. Can't quite read it here on this. I think that's about 1991 or 2 right in there. Church was started about 1981 with about 6 or 10 people. And the church grew the first 10 years to about 400. And they called a new pastor right here. And the church now has grown. You can see now is upwards into a little over 1,000 in 2012. That's last year. But notice something. Do you see what's happening? This pastor now is retiring this year. He's in his late 60s. And when he came to the church back here almost some 30 years ago, or maybe it's 20 years ago, he was younger and the church began to grow. But look how it's starting to plateau. Do you see it? It's still growing a little. But the church now is 40 years old. And it's beginning to show the signs of the normal life cycle. Most churches, the growth years are in the first 5 to 20 years of the church's life. And then the church naturally begins to go on a plateau. And if it stays on the plateau long enough, then it naturally begins to decline. But these are real churches. The earlier picture I showed you is just a sample of a life cycle curve. But churches, are different. They're just like us. All of us go through the normal life cycle of human beings, but we're all different. And it's the same with churches. Churches tend to go through natural life cycles, but churches are all different. But you can see these real churches, how it actually looks. So when a church goes through the life cycle, it typically goes through 5 stages. All right? Now, stage 1 is what I call the emerging church, right here. It's the first 5 years of the church. Now, we're still on page 11. So we're still on page 11, number 2. All right? Churches predictably go through a natural life cycle. Um, the first 5 years of a church's life are really the most dangerous years of its life. It's much like starting a business. I don't know if this is true in Manila, but in the United States, most businesses fail in the first 5 years. Somebody will go in and start a business, and if it makes it past the first 5 years, then the business will be there for many, many years. But most of the failure of a business is in the first 5 years. Well, the same is true in church plants. When a church is started, it's like a baby church. And the first 5 years are the most critical years of that church's life. That's when a church is forming its identity. A new baby church is determining who it is, what its name is, what its heritage is, what its vision is, what its purpose is, where it's heading in life. If you've ever been part of a brand new church, it's exciting. A brand new church has a vision. A brand new church is very flexible. They meet here this week, and maybe they meet another place the next week, and then they find a facility for a month, and then they have to move again, and they move to another facility. And new churches are constantly changing and moving. A new church will start a ministry. If it doesn't work, they just cancel it. That's all, and start another ministry. There's no history in a new church that keeps them from canceling something or trying something new. So new churches are very flexible, very fluid. It's like babies. When I was a baby, I don't really remember it. I want you to know. But my mother took a picture of me. I was 6 months old. I'm lying on my back, and I have my foot all the way up into my mouth. I pull it up there. Now, babies are flexible, right? They can stretch, then babies roll off of a chair or something, and of course we're scared, but they're okay usually. Babies are flexible and floppy, and so here this picture is of me with my foot in my mouth. Now, I want you to know, there is no way today I can get my foot in my mouth. I can't do it. I can't. I don't have the flexibility because I'm older. See, now, when you're a baby church and you're an emerging church, you're flexible. You need to move, you move. You need to do a new ministry, you do a new ministry. You need to do worship different, you do worship different. Nobody cares. It's flexible. It's new. Just do what you want, And so the new church is creative and exciting, and people come in and people serve. Everybody serves. Anybody comes in, we put them to work. Why? Because we need everybody in a new church to work. Well, that's the new baby church. It's exciting to be in a new church plant. If you've ever been in one, they're exciting places to be. Now, if a church survives that first 5 years, it moves into what we call a growing church. And most churches, most of their numerical growth occurs between the years 5 and the years 20. So you'll have about 15 years of good growth. Now, that doesn't always happen. It depends on each church. It's just like human beings. When does most of our growth happen? It happens from our birth to our early 20s. And then somewhere in our 20s, basically, our bodies stop growing. But you know how it is with teenagers. Teenagers will go to bed, and you just bought them a brand new pair of shoes, and they wake up the next morning, and the shoes don't fit. Why? They grew. And they come in, they say, Mom, Dad, my shoes are hurting me, or my pants are too short. And you say, what? I just bought you those. Well, they're growing. Well, that's what happens in a church. Usually between about the 5th year and about the 20th year in the life of a church, there's rapid growth and development. That's when people are coming to faith in Christ, and you typically purchase your first properties, and you build your first buildings, and you support your first missionaries, and you get your pastor full time, and you may even, if your church grows, you hire a couple of staff members. That's usually within that first 5 to 10 to 20 years in the life of the church. And people volunteer. People will get involved in the ministry easily. They understand your vision. They understand your passion. And they want to be a part of this new church that's so exciting and moving forward. Well, that's a great time. It's a great time. But now think with me. If you're the church planter, and let's say that you're 30 years old when you plant the church, 20 years old, figure it out with me. 20 years later, how old are you? You're 50. You're 50. So let me use my little pointer again. Right down here, you're 30. Here, you're 35. Here, you're 50. Do you see what's starting to happen? You're tired. Whew, man, I have worked for 20 years hard to grow this church. I have trained and taught and evangelized and dealt with problems. And I am just going to sit back and enjoy the rest of my career as a pastor. And what happens to the church? Starts plateauing. And you see what happens is all the people who join the church in that first 20 years, they're usually younger than you. Most church planters, when they plant a church, they typically reach people who are younger than them. Now, this is natural. See, in my very first church, I was 28 years old. And I was trying to tell these people what we needed to do, but they would not listen to me. And I could not understand why they wouldn't listen to me. But they were all like my grandparents. Now, how many of us would listen to our grandchildren? I know I wouldn't. Now that I have grandchildren, I look at my grandchildren, and all of a sudden I understand how those people in my first church viewed me. I was younger than their grandchildren. I was their pastor, and they respected me as their pastor. But when I said to them, let's sell this property and move over here, they said no. And I didn't understand why. Well, I was like their grandchild. I was too young. But see, now in a church plant, what happens is that people come into the church, into a new church plant, they usually want to look up to their pastor. They want to feel as though their pastor has gone through life ahead of them and can give them wisdom. And so in new church plants, you tend to attract people who are a little bit younger than you, maybe 5 years younger than you. So if you're 50 at this point, a lot of the people in the church are going to be 40, 45. And they've been with you for a long, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. They've been with you. And they're tired too. They've worked hard too, right along beside you, doing ministry. And everybody's tired. And so the tendency is that you just, let's take a break.